corporation for nonprofit. We don't receive any tax money. We're not supported by the city, the county, the state, or not really by anybody else sometimes when you look at our financial statement. But we persevere and been in business here 150 years. We have about 15,000 burials, is that right, Jamie, approximately? For many years, the population of the cemetery equaled the population of the city of Norwalk. Now it's fallen a little behind, but for a long time the town had about the same population as the cemetery. Before this cemetery was started, they buried in the Episcopal Cemetery on West Main Street. That was becoming full. It was never taken care of. It wasn't owned by the village, so they couldn't spend public money on it. So they decided to make this, they called this at that time the New Cemetery. It was not called Woodlawn until about 1880, when the editor of the newspaper campaigned to have the street out here renamed from Medina Street to Woodlawn Avenue, because that sounded a little classier. So they renamed the cemetery then to be Woodlawn Cemetery instead of just the New Cemetery. We're starting our tour here at the public mausoleum, which was built about 1920, and we'll go inside. If you didn't see it yesterday, you can see how the crypts are arranged, or you can of course look at it again. Charles Stacy, who was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, is entombed here. We have in our cemetery 2 Medal of Honor winners, Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and that is not common to one cemetery. Even some national cemeteries, which have thousands of veterans buried, do not have 2 Medal of Honor winners. There's a memorial stone here for Mr. Stacy. He was a sharpshooter at Gettysburg during the Civil War, and after we put this tour together and realized that we had 2 such distinguished persons buried here, the cemetery arranged to get those stones from the government. We'll see the other one as we go on. He, by the way, Mr. Stacy, is entombed in crypt number 111, which is to the right when we go in here on the back wall. Also buried in here, you'll see, I'll point him out to you, is Stephen M. Young, who was a U.S. Congressman, and he is one of 4 U.S. Congressmen who are buried here at Woodlawn Cemetery, which I consider another unusual point, perhaps, that the Norwalk area produced 4 U.S. Congressmen, and one is buried out in the old Episcopal Cemetery on West Main Street, so actually 5 men are buried here who have served in the United States Congress. So if you want to come in and look around the mausoleum, you can. This, by the way, generally is not open. Memorial Day is about the only day sometimes that it is unlocked. All of the people who own crypts or their families have a key, but we don't keep it unlocked for obvious reasons all the time. But you're welcome to come on in. And of course, take a special note on this historical tour of the donation box. Okay, the second spot on the tour, and we don't necessarily have to walk over there, although we can if you want, is the Veterans Lot right next door here. This is actually owned by the county, County Veteran Service Administration, and any Huron County veteran who's eligible can be buried there, not their families or any family members. But that was started during World War II, and I'm not sure how many burials are there right now, about 200 I think, aren't there? 150, 200, and there is room for many more burials for a long, long time. And as we go on, we'll see the old Veterans Burial Lot, which is where many Civil War veterans are buried. So if you're ready, we'll just go right around here to my right. This on your own. These brochures are available at the office, or if anybody else ever does. There's an outside box there, and every one of the stops is numbered. And we were talking about this after the story was in the paper the other day, which most of you probably saw. I had 2 comments. One was I should include a certain person's burial here that's not on the tour, and the other was I omitted mentioning somebody of all the people we did mention. I, of course, omitted the wrong one, as if I wrote the story. But we decided we could make about 10 different tours. One would be military, one would be unusual monuments, one would be local celebrities, and so on and so on and so on. Anyway, we're not going to do that right away. This is stop number 3, as you'll see on your brochure. And when this lady, Sarah Bly, was buried here, died in 1907, her husband was sent a telegram by one of his Civil War comrades. About 250 words in it, and Henry Bly, who was her husband, who's buried there next to her, was so impressed with it, he had it cut on here as her epitaph, because during the Civil War, Mrs. Bly lived with her husband for a time at the front and helped nurse the men who had been wounded and who were sick, and they therefore had good feelings toward her. So that was carved on her tombstone, and it's still pretty legible. And it was written by a man named A.M. Wilson, or Albert Wilson, who lived in Toledo, and he was the adjutant, I believe it was, in Captain Bly's company. And after the Civil War, he founded the Wilson Spice Company in Toledo, and that was one of the first big distributors of wholesale foods, packaged foods. Matter of fact, I believe he originated the thing of pre-packaging coffee. They sold a variety of coffee called Red Lion, and every so often, if you're antique interest, you'll see a little trade card show up from stores, something Red Lion coffee. But he lived in Toledo. He's from this area originally. And a year or so ago, much to our chagrin, we realized Captain Bly had no monument here marking his burial. So I arranged for that through the Veterans Service Office, so that he would have a stone also. But if you ever, I'm not going to try to read this to you today, but if you have nothing else to do in an afternoon, come out and read that telegram. So we'll move on to number 4, which is right down the way. The J.P. Williams, who is the other Congressional Medal of Honor winner, who's buried here at Woodlawn. He was in the Spanish-American War and then stayed in the U.S. Navy and was in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 in China. I don't know what his particular meritorious thing was, but after he retired, he came to Norwalk to live. He had originally lived around Shinrock or Berlin Heights when he enlisted in the Spanish-American War, but he lived in Norwalk for several years, and as I said, is one of our 2 Medal of Honor winners. But when we originated this tour about 20 years ago, we saw to it that each Medal of Honor winner had that special marker. You see, it has the emblem of the Medal of Honor and then has the words, because that's a special monument that the Veterans Administration issues. I wanted to say something too as we go along, if I can spot one. There's one right there. Alan's leaning against. The marker looks like the stump of a tree, and many of those were put up by the lodge called the Woodmen of the World, which I found out a while ago, I think still exists in some places.
It does.
And
sells insurance.
Yeah, that's basically what they were anyway. They were fraternal lodge, but they were life insurance. And they would put those up for their deceased members. I'm not sure this one is, but there are some here in Woodlawn that are. And they, of course, look like a tree. And I suppose if it was a young person, it was cut off lower because the young person was cut off sooner in life and so forth. And even the little headstones back here look like a chunk of wood for the family. But as we go along, I'll try to point some out. For instance, right here is one that's a statue, as though it's an angel looking over the burial places. There's one down there on the Hay Monument that's called Despair. It's right straight down from me. It's a woman holding her head like this. They were, if you could afford it, they were very common markers. Now it probably costs you about $10,000 to buy something like that. But there are many different. We'll see some symbolic ones. Look, if I can. But it does not say he died on a certain date. It says he was born into spirit life. And the spiritualists, believe you went to a spirit life after your death on earth. I'm not sure if that's what he was a spiritualist or not. If you don't know what the spiritualists were, those are the people who believe you could communicate with the dead. And they would hold seances and have mediums who talk to people who had died long before. But I don't know if that's what that means, but I was found out. This is the burial place of Frank D. Reed, who died in 1891, and he was the first American child born in Huron County. He was born near Steuben right about the time the War of 1812 started, and his parents had to leave their home when he was little and go to Mansfield for safety because the Indians and the British were thought to be right around the corner. He lived most of his life in Huron County, around the Norwalk area, and as a young boy was a great hunter. He was considered to be a great hunter and a great woodsman. And he had that special distinction of being the first American child born in Huron County. And We go from here right across the driveway. On it. Very often in the 19th century, when a small child died, they put the lamb on there, representing, of course, the lamb being an infant and the biblical connotation of it. Because many times you'll see those markers with a lamb on it.
Lake Beach.
Matter of fact, when the cemetery was first, this area was first being used, every time they dug a grave in here, they found Indian relics. They found either axe heads or arrowheads, whatever. And of course, at that time, all these graves were dug by hand. Even in the coldest weather until 1879, when two men spent all day with axes trying to dig in the frozen ground. That's when they built the receiving vault that we'll see later. Well, this is the burial place of Abner Baker, one of the 3 Revolutionary soldiers buried here in Woodlawn Cemetery, veterans of the American Revolution. All 3 of them originally were buried at the Episcopal Cemetery on West Main Street, and later when this cemetery was started and their families were making family lots, they had those burials moved here. He's buried here on the lot of his son, Timothy Baker, with a number of other family members. There probably, I suppose, are about 20 graves here. I'm not sure how many, but in the old section, you see these large lots where a number of family members are buried. And Mr. Baker is one of, as I said, one of the 3 who are buried here. Burial place of William Gallup and his wife Sally. Her maiden name was Bolt, and her father, John Bolt, owned this farm in the early 1800s. And they were married on this farm in 1819. The house where they were married was up toward the corner, more toward the intersection up there. And they lived for many years in Tiffin. I believe they ended up living near Dayton. And when they died, it was their wish that they be brought back here and buried on this same farm where they had spent their young years. And William Gallup at one time was a chair maker here in Norwalk, but they wanted to come back and be buried here on their original spot. And then right over here, not very far away, here on this lot, and we don't know where because they didn't leave us a record of it and they never put up a tombstone for him, is the very first burial that took place in the cemetery 150 years ago this month. On July 13th, 1854, a little boy 6 months old died by the name of Herbert Barnhart. And this happens to be his older brothers, and his wife are buried here. And his parents were also buried here, but no one ever put up markers, and the burial records then were not kept as good as they are now. And we just know that he is buried on this lot. So, as I said, the cemetery was founded in February of 1854, and it was not until July that the first burial took place. And it was almost a year later that the second burial, which was down the way there. In that summer of 1854, shortly after little Herbert Barnhart was buried here, we had a cholera epidemic in Norwalk, the last big cholera epidemic. And they had a pest house, they called it, straight back in here on the bank of Norwalk Creek. The pest house was simply a contagion hospital. It was where the cholera people were taken who were sick, and they had to isolate them because cholera was so terribly contagious and they didn't even really know for sure what it was caused by. So they isolated them. And one morning the caretaker here at the cemetery was up early and was out walking around just checking things over and looking things over, and one of the patients had escaped, and he met him it was very early in the morning, and it was not quite daylight and a little foggy, and here was this guy with a nightgown on walking around, and I guess changed the caretaker's mind about a few things perhaps in all that time. But cholera was a tragedy of those early days, but none of those cholera people was buried here in Woodlawn, and I have seen a reference in later years where a man said they were buried back someplace on the bank of the creek, and I don't know if that's true. You know, the cholera was so terribly contagious. If someone died of it, they immediately took them out of the house, out of the room, and buried them because that was the only thing they knew to do to get rid of the cholera. But none of them are buried here in Woodlawn.
Henry, where's the guy buried that his picture's in the library, the First Patient Library
He's buried at St. Paul's Cemetery, Edward Cripps. I don't know where, but that's the closest I can narrow it down. We get down here to our next